Welcome back to another round of Basis Picks. As always, like and subscribe, share with a friend, colleague, relative, associate, enemy, and any and all in between. It's appreciated. There's quite a few fights on today, and I do mean today as in Friday. Then obviously we've got a couple of pretty tasty cards on Saturday. As you guys know, I am not gonna be watching the Fury versus Ngannou box office event. I haven't paid for it, nor am I going to. After the event, I probably will check out some of the undercard fights because I do want to see a couple of those, even if I've known the results. But with that being said, I'm gonna just talk on the main fight for this Friday. Then we're gonna talk about the undercard fights for tomorrow in Riyadh, and then finally we'll end it off with the Matchroom card taking place in Cancun, Mexico. So without further ado, let's get into the picks. Okay, so short and sweet, Jonathan Bomba Gonzalez is supposed to be facing Geraldo Zapata tonight, but for some reason it's still not showing up on BoxRec. So even though I think the fight is taking place, I'm not sure why it's not on there. There's been a lot of cards recently that aren't showing up on BoxRec. That being said, I think Zapata is actually a late replacement. I can't remember the name of Gonzalez's previous opponent, but I think he's had 5 weeks notice or so about the change. So yeah, he's had to readjust his camp and whatnot, but I do think ultimately he's gonna have enough to get through this. I feel like his level, he's a lot more seasoned than obviously Geraldo Zapata, and I feel as if that experience should sort of lead to not a comfortable victory, because I know Zapata is actually, he's not heavy-handed, but he hits quite hard for someone. I think he's only got like 5 KOs on the record. But yeah, I've just got a feeling that Gonzalez is gonna sort of coast to a nice comfortable decision win on this one. I'm not ruling out a knockout, but realistically I think it's gonna be a I think it's gonna be a KO. I think it's gonna be a decision. Now moving on to the you've got the DAZN card with Amanda Serrano headlining against Danila Ramos in the first women's title bout for the featherweight division. I think it's the second title challenge that has been contested over 12 3-minute rounds, but it's the first one for, I guess, for unified titles, and it's the first one obviously in the featherweight division. So I think that 12 3-minute rounds is gonna benefit Amanda Serrano quite well. Now Amanda is very much a front runner when it comes to her fights. If you look at the majority of her fights and when she stops people, it's always been sort of the first 4 rounds of the fight, the first 4 or 5 rounds. So usually if you can take her outside of those, you can normally get to the you can get to the end, you can see the final bell, whether you win on the decision, whether you or whether you lose via decision. But you can normally survive the fight if you make it past the first 4 or 5 rounds, because she is a very much a sort of a front runner in fights. Now, while she doesn't slow down, I feel like the power, she maybe doesn't put as much effort into the shots, and it's more about the activity after that, just making sure that she can kind of win the rounds. Amanda, she's very good to the body. So if Danila sort of sits and trades with her, I feel like this fight doesn't go very long at all. Amanda is very good at wearing out an opponent's body, so Danila's best option is to try and sort of set traps, box more on the back foot, not enough that it looks like she's running, but she's got to stay just far enough away that Amanda can't plant her feet to let the shots go, and then sort of trade in the exchanges. However, that's not really something that Danila Ramos is known for doing. So just for that simple fact, and the fact that there's an extra minute in each round to work, I do have a feeling that she will get worn down and worn out. And whereas Amanda normally gets people out sort of in the first half of fights when she does get her KOs, I actually think this one is going to go maybe 6 to 7, and I can see Amanda taking her out within 8. So and I feel like it will be via body shots as well, body accumulation, or maybe like corner might throw a towel in. But yeah, I'm predicting between rounds 7 and 8 for Amanda Serrano stoppage victory to retain all of her belts, barring the WBC, which isn't on the line anyway because they won't sanction 12 3 minutes for the women. But yeah, that's the pick. So see what happens. Okay, so next we'll be looking at the Battle of the Baddest card taking place in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The undercard for this event is actually very, very good in terms of an undercard. There are some fights on there that I actually feel would have been better served if people were facing other people. But with that being said, there's a lot of, I want to say, up and coming talent in the heavyweight division. That's not quite accurate, just maybe the people that are like, you know, maybe on the B tier, sort of the level below, like the world level. Those guys that are sort of trying to push their way through to sort of that world level, and then maybe make it to the elite. Now, quite frankly, personally, I would have preferred to see Arslanbek Makhmudov and Martin Bakole facing each other instead of facing separate opponents on the card. There's definitely the money to do it, but with that being said, I definitely think Martin Bakole's got the better fight of the two. With that being said, all right, so let's run through those fights real quick. Obviously, Moses Atalma, I'm predicting a straight KO within the first 4 rounds. I've seen the record, and I've seen one of the fights for his opponent. I don't remember his name, nor do I care to. That's how little attention I'm paying to it. But yeah, that's going to be good exposure for him. Now, if we look at Carlos Takam versus Martin Bakole. Now, Carlos Takam is one of those guys. He's probably one of the best fighters never to win a world title in sort of the modern era. Like, if you look at his record, if you look at who he's been in the ring with, like he's one of those guys. He's a bit like Derek Chisora in the sense that he will fight anyone, he'll give it his all, but unlike Derek Chisora, he seems to have maintained better in terms of like punch resistance, in terms of how he sort of navigates fights. Now, you know, saying that, obviously Derek Chisora brutally knocked him out, what was it, about 5 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago. But with that being said, like, he was, you know, putting a beating on Derek Chisora, and it was like literally a Hail Mary, one Hail Mary shot that changed the tide of the fight. So even when he fought Joseph Parker, when he fought Carlos Takam, when he fought Alexander Povetkin, he lost those fights, but they were still highly competitive. When he fought Anthony Joshua, he gave Anthony Joshua problems. I feel like he was unfairly stopped against Joshua and Joe Joyce. The Joe Joyce fight, he gave Joe Joyce some problems as well. He's a very capable guy. He's 42 years old, so that doesn't necessarily work in his favor. But let's be real, Martin Bakole isn't 30 or 31, so I think they're quite similar in age, realistically. But look, this is one of those fights, I feel that, because Carlos Takam is quite good at tucking up behind the shoulder and sort of getting underneath shots and working his way onto the inside. So I don't think Martin Bakole is going to have a huge amount of success trying to keep the range long behind the jab and sort of setting him up for straight punches. I feel as if he's going to have to do a lot of exchanges inside the pocket with Takam, and the question there will become whose arms are shorter to the distance to the target. Now, funnily enough, Carlos Takam, I think, actually has a larger and a longer wingspan and reach than Martin Bakole does. So in those inside exchanges, he may actually be at more of a disadvantage, because Bakole's shots should be able to reach the target quicker than his do. Takam's tough. He has been knocked out a couple of times, but usually every time he's been knocked out has been, a proper knockout, as in like slumped on the floor, has been by someone the same height as him. So someone that, has access to his, that has a big access to his chin from the same trajectory that he's looking at. Whereas the taller guys, he's usually able to, like I said, ride and roll under shots. So with that being said, I do expect Martin Bakole to win this fight, purely because there's a lot more upside in him. So if it's a close fight, it's more benefit in him winning it, I suppose, than Carlos Takam. Although, to be fair, because Takam is quite older and is more known and probably more beatable, you might give him a decision in that sense, because then he could be more beatable for another opponent than what Bakole might be, and he's got a bigger name. But I do think that Bukoli wins. I do think he does enough actually to win a points decision, similar to when he fought Sergey Kuzmin. Could this fight end in a knockout? Yes, it could. There is every chance that he could, you know, put the punches together, similar to what he did with Shevardusky, and get Carlos Takam out of there. But based on sort of the Arslanbek Makhmudov fight, even though I know that Bukoli is quite a little bit better in terms of sort of his technical mechanics than Makhmudov, but based on the fact that he was able to survive that fight, you know, and sort of take Makhmudov into areas that he's not experienced before, I can see him doing similar with Bukoli. And if it gets to sort of that second half, rounds 5, 6, 7, where Bukoli's now got to start managing his reserves and his gas tank, that's where Carlos Takam could really shine, because, you know, Bukoli's never really had the best of engines. Whenever he's had to go kind of looking for people, he starts to wane. We've seen it with Michael Hunter. It happened even in the Tony Yoka fight. He started sort of slowing down really quite badly towards the back half of that fight, even though he was winning it comfortably. But I do think that he will do enough to get this fight on points. I'm predicting a points decision, but if it's a knockout, I won't be surprised. Real quick, Arslanbek Makhmudov against Anthony Jr. Wright. Yeah, I don't give Wright a prayer getting out of the first 2 rounds. He'll be lucky if he gets out of the first, to be honest. Yeah, I'm not even really going to say much more about that. Makhmudov, again, he's not the most technical guy, but what he does carry is power from every angle in every shot that he throws. I think his body mechanics are just suited to, if he lands, if he connects, it's good night. And I just can't. I've seen a few bits of Wright's work to suggest that he doesn't have anything to be able to trouble Arslanbek Makhmudov. So I am predicting a knockout inside 2 rounds is what I've put on my bet in my accumulator, because it wouldn't let me do rounds 1 to 3. But yeah, it doesn't go past 3 rounds, and if it does, then something's wrong. That's my official opinion on that. Moving up the card now, you've got Joseph Parker versus Simon Keane. Now, Simon Keane is actually a pretty decent opponent. Like, look, he's not a guy that most people know because he fights out of Quebec in Canada, but I've seen a few of his fights. He's very heavy-handed and he's very much a front runner. He's the kind of guy, again, very similar to Makhmudov and sort of those type of guys, and even Amanda Serrano, as I mentioned earlier. Like, he's a person, if he's gonna knock you out, it's usually gonna be in the first sort of 4 or 5 rounds of the fight. He carries his power sort of on the first half, and then he sort of starts to labor a bit more on the second. Now, he hasn't really been in there hugely with any real opponents of note. He's got some wins where, like, if you go on his box rec, you say, oh yeah, I recognize that name, but they weren't necessarily, like, you know, anyone in their prime or even close to their prime. They was all very much faded. Joseph Parker, on the other hand, look, he's only got 3 losses, and they have been against legit world level opponents in Anthony Joshua, Dillian White, and then Joe Joyce. Joe Joyce being the only one to obviously KO him. Now, he has rebounded since that defeat, so he's back to winning ways. So at this point, it's just about seeing how he manages and navigates those first few rounds. But Parker is definitely the faster of the two in the ring, and he's the better combination puncher of the two. I'm not sure what the gas tank is going to be like, because he has started to look to put on more mass and size, as opposed to that more lean structure that he had before when he was in sort of the mid to high 230s. You know, he came in at 250 pounds, so he's definitely going to be looking to sit on those shots. But I do think that knowing that Simon Keane, when he does get hit, he doesn't necessarily do his best to sort of keep his construct and sort of ride that hit out and then, you know, sort of return back. He normally he gets stunned and he's sort of shells a little bit until his head's clear. With Joseph Parker, he will throw those combinations, and I do expect that when that does happen, ultimately Simon Keane will end up you know, crashing to the canvas once, maybe even twice. But I do see this fight getting stopped. It's a 10 rounder, so I actually think the stoppage will take place between sort of round 7 and 8. with it being competitive somewhat in the first couple rounds, but not hugely. That's the opinion. So I do think Joseph Parker will win via stoppage KO in round 7 or 8. Now, moving on to what I would call, and I guess what a lot of people would call, the people's main event of this broadcast. That is Fabio Wardley versus David Adeleye. Now, with this one, initially my first thoughts was, Fabio Wardley wins this all day. He's been in there with the better level of competition. He's had to deal with more adversity. He's a guy that can show that he can ride out a crisis. He can defend himself when he's hurt, and also he can come back and exchange. He has a little bit of a Nigel Benn mentality, whereby Nigel Benn was at his most dangerous when he was hurt. Like, that's the time when you almost had to back off in the ring and go for a walk and let his head clear, because when the moment you hurt him and he actually felt hurt and afraid, that's normally the moment where 2 seconds later you ended up on the floor, or you ended up in a world of pain yourself. And that's very much kind of how Fabio Wardley is. Like, he'll box. Sometimes he might get outboxed, he might get hit, he might get caught, but as soon as he gets caught with something that either buzzes him quite hard, or it looks like, oh, now you're about to open up, he just decides to open up. And thus far it's worked for him against everyone that he's faced. David Adeleye, on the other hand, he's a naturally sort of, he's smaller guy in terms of his his weight management, but if you look at his actual frame, you can tell that naturally I do believe he's actually a stronger guy than Fabio Wardley naturally. Like, if you look at his body, minus maybe the legs, we'll talk about that in a moment, but you can tell that a lot of his strength just looks like it's genetic, as opposed to just in the gym pumping weights, and his aesthetics almost kind of lead me to that to sort of that conclusion. Whereas when it comes to Fabio Wardley, you can tell that a lot of his size and mass has been done in the gym, strength and conditioning training, eating. When he started his career, I remember the first time I saw him, I think he was like 217 pounds maybe, or 220, somewhere in that range. And then in the space of like 3 to 4 years, like, he's put on nearly 24 pounds of extra size. Now, part of that is obviously because you don't want to get manhandled by other fighters and stuff in the ring, but I always said I was concerned by him putting on the weight, because ultimately that then is going to change. You're going to lose speed, you might lose stamina, because now you're having to push your body to do more with more weight on it. He's never been past 6 rounds, so with that extra mass on him, how will he cope with that? We've never seen it. Same with Adeleye, we've never seen him past 6 rounds as well. I think if they get into clinches, and the only reason I say this is because I feel like even though Fabio's body is more manufactured in the gym as opposed to natural, it looks like he's leveled his entire body out. Like, his legs look in proportion to his upper body and to his torso, whereas with Adeleye, his legs are quite skinny. Now he's probably got sort of that that skinny man power, but when you look at that as obviously a base for a 6'5" guy with quite a big solid upper body, when you take a shot, a big shot especially, and you don't have that that solid foundation below to sort of keep you steady, that could be where issues come about. So I'm taking kind of all of this stuff into account. It's very hard for me to ultimately think about this. I feel like in terms of the exchanges, Adeleye is definitely in the lead in terms of like the mental warfare. But when Fabio does say, well, everything you're saying is hypothetical because we've never seen it, you've never proved that, he's got a point. Everyone knows about the Sokolowski fight, whereby that shouldn't have been as hard of a fight as it was for David, and whether you believe he did win or he lost, it didn't show him in the best light. Now, he's done much better since then, but again, he hasn't been in there with, I don't think he's been in there with an opponent since that was better than Sokolowski. So it's almost like he was kept at a certain level to keep developing. Now he's got the big step up here. Can he make the necessary adjustment? Look, fundamentally, he's got a bit more of the amateur pedigree than Fabio. Fabio has had to learn everything on the job. I feel like the one thing that Fabio has in his arsenal, maybe that David doesn't have, is that when he was learning on the job, he wasn't having to rewrite programming from an amateur code where it's a lot more about that point scoring and just sort of reaching a target. He was being trained as a pro in the tricks and the trades of what a pro does. Those early fights when he was training with like Alexander Usyk and sparring with Usyk in those early years when he was just learning all of that stuff. Yeah, you don't get that sort of that amateur background to be able to adjust to other styles, but because there's a lot of rewriting that your brain has to do, you make and you tailor your style quite quickly. So I feel like he's got that where he doesn't have to, everything he does is more instinctive to him rather than sort of programmed. But that could also be what gets him hurt, because Adeleye will know people, or will have fought similar-ish type people to Wardley in the amateurs, and I feel like he probably knows how to make those adjustments. The fight is ultimately going to be won on who can impose themselves in the ring and who can control center. I think Fabio's more likely to control the center of the ring, because I feel like Adeleye will look to back off a bit more and try to set traps. The question is, does Fabio fall into them? I do think the first half of this fight is gonna be, the first round I think is gonna be super cagey, regardless of what they've said. There will be some 1 or 2 big punches exchanged, but I feel like they're definitely gonna more probe to see what the other guy is gonna do, look for the tells, so that they can enact a plan after that. That being said, from round 2, round 3 is where I think the action really picks up, and I think Fabio gets hurt in one of those rounds, round 2 or round 3. Probably a shot that he doesn't see coming. I'm not sure if he hits the canvas, but there's a chance he could. However, once he gets up, if David goes to apply instantaneous pressure, I think that's Fabio's best tactic to sort of come back into the fight, because he just wants a war. Whereas if David applies smart and sophisticated pressure and doesn't rush in to finish the fight, I think he then sort of takes Fabio Wardley out in about 8 rounds. But I do think with the bright lights on Adeleye and him never fighting someone at this level before, not to say that Fabio's levels above him, but he's definitely at least a level above thus far based on competition. I do think actually Fabio comes through a crisis early, has a trade-off with David. I think he hurts David. I think he tests David's chin, and I think inside 5 rounds, Fabio Wardley gets a KO decision. I mean, a KO victory. I could be wrong, but yeah, I can either see Adeleye in 8 or I can see Fabio in 5, but I'm going with Fabio in and around the 5th round. And yeah, I guess we'll just have to wait and see if I'm right or I'm wrong about that one. Last but not least, we go to the Matchroom card taking place in Cancun, Mexico. Now, I don't know all of the fights on the card, however, I will just be focusing on the chief support and the main event of the fight. So, chief support is Justice Huni versus Andrew Tabiti. Now, Andrew Tabiti is 20-1 thus far, former cruiserweight, now sort of campaigning and fluctuating between heavyweight and cruiserweight, but I don't think he'll ever go back to cruiserweight, to be honest. The money for him is in the heavyweight division. Justice Huni also is a smaller heavyweight, sort of around, normally ranging between sort of the 230 to the 240 mark, but he's a combination puncher, very fast, very fluid, very decorated amateur from Australia. Now, I think if you go for this in terms of skill sets, they're actually pretty similarly matched. Like Tabiti is a very accomplished fighter in his own right. He had a fairly decent amateur career. Didn't sort of win anything major as an amateur, but you know, he boxed a lot of the necessary heavyweights at amateur that you would sort of need to. And he came up in the Mayweather gym, so you know, he was very much a part of sort of the TMT promotions and stuff. So he's been in and around that craft. So in terms of an operator in the ring, he's a very good operator. Justice Hooney obviously has got more of the amateur pedigree, more of the decorated amateur background, and he's a much younger guy, so he's got a lot more upside to him than Andrew Tabiti does. The problem that Justice has at the moment is he's kind of gone from being a boxer, a pure boxer puncher type style, whereby, you know, he's basically, you know, tagging people from the outside, getting in and out with his combinations, throwing lead uppercuts, hooks around the side, you know, and getting stoppages sort of through accumulation, because he hasn't necessarily knocked a lot of people out in like the first or second round. He's been sort of called a non-puncher and say, oh, he doesn't really hit hard, he doesn't have punching power. And as such, because of that, when he changed trainers, he's more of adopted a bit more of a pressure fighter type style now, where he'll sit in the pocket and trade with someone to prove that he's a power puncher and that he can take people out. Now, while he hasn't lost doing this thus far, it is a concern, because he's got enough power, but he's not the hardest puncher. His bread and butter is boxing, moving, and staying out of the way. If he stands and trades in the pocket with too many people, even though he can be switched on and he's got a very good chin, you don't want to run the risk of giving someone who's not as good as you, you know, ultimately giving them an opportunity to tag you when you don't need to. That being said, Andrew Tabiti, while he again also has respectable power, his power isn't you know, super tough or super dense for you to have to write home about either. So if Hooney does decide to sort of try and walk him down, he probably will get, I think he will get sort of, you know, caught and countered on a few occasions. But I do think that front foot pressure might be the best way for him to go about tracking Tabiti, because Tabiti is not just going to stand and trade and sort of sit in the phone booth with you. So I think Hooney will have to go hunting for him. I think that he will hurt Tabiti at some point in the fight, but Tabiti, he's good enough whereby he'll be able to, you know, I think he'll be able to ride it out. The only person who's ever, you know, really ironed him out was Junior Dorticos, but Dorticos punches probably was the hardest punching guy at cruiserweight. So it's no mean feat to get knocked out by him. I do think this fight goes distance, but I do think that Justice Hooney just shows that his amateur pedigree is just a little bit more pronounced than Tabiti's, you know, rounds and years in the gym, in the Mayweather gym. So I do think he wins it on a points decision, and I think it will be a unanimous one. It's a 10 rounder, I believe, so I'm thinking 97, 93, 96, 94 type fight. It won't be easy, but I think it will be fairly comprehensive who the winner is at the end of it. Next, moving to Shaki Foster against Eduardo Rocky Hernandez. Now, this one I've been thinking back and forth about. Shaki Foster definitely is the better boxer from everything I've seen. He's had a bit of a up and down career, but he's made of tough stuff. He's not the kind of guy that's just gonna fold under pressure. He can hit, he can box, he can move, he's got good angles, he's a switcher as well. So if he wants to box southpaw, he can box southpaw. If he wants to box orthodox, he'll box orthodox. Now I think that's probably his best bet, is to switch between stances when Rocky feels like he's having success, because if he does the switching, obviously from a certain distance, Rocky then has to reset his distance and try to figure out exactly, all right, how he's gonna make the attack. On the other hand, you've got Rocky Hernandez, who is very much a come forward fighter. He's He's got pretty decent fundamentals in terms of like hand placement, but he does have sort of a technical, very sort of typical high guard where he'll sort of come in, try to walk his opponent down and just throw heavy lever. And he will do that from round 1 until the fight ends. Now, usually a lot of his fights will end first half. I've not seen many times him go a 10 or 12 round distance. I'm not sure if he has that in the tank. That being said, most Mexicans, because a lot of Mexico is high altitude, you find that they have engines for days, so they don't get tired no matter how much punches they throw. Now, him throwing wide punches could mean he ends up getting countered in between the shots, but I just feel that even though he is more crude and basic compared to a Shaki Foster, I feel that the ring's going to be quite small, so Foster can't necessarily move and keep out of the weight of a lot of stuff, and I just feel like the consistent pressure is going to be something that gets to him sort of as the rounds start to go ahead. So I feel like he's going to be doing fairly well in the first half of the fight, probably winning it like sort of 4 rounds to 2, 5 rounds to 1. But again, when there's nowhere to move and you're constantly being dragged into the war and punches are being thrown and you've got to keep thinking and adjusting, I just feel like he might end up switching off at one point and get hurt, get caught, and then basically be in survival mode for a few more rounds. So my prediction is, and I have no huge confidence in this one, but I do think that Rocky Hernandez will win this fight via KO round 8, between rounds 8 and 10. I feel like he'll just keep throwing, and when the Shaki gets tired, he gets caught with something, and eventually the ref jumps in and waves it off. So that's the prediction. Again, I've got no faith in that one, so if I'm wrong, I mean, look, you can kill me in the comments, it's fine, but that's just how I see it. Anyway, this has been a long video, been a lot of fights to go over. Leave your comments down below, let me know what you think is going to take place, and I'll catch you on the next one. But for right now, that's Basis Picks locked.